Hi, and welcome to our professional development series titled Just Keep Meeting, Individualized Education Program Meeting Strategies. I'm Dr. Tracy Gershwin, Professor of Special Education and Board Certified Behavior Analyst, and I'm really looking forward to presenting this topic with you. First of all, we have some pretty important objectives to cover today. And what I'd like to emphasize is that we will like to talk about providing meaningful, individualized education program meeting strategies for all stages of the process. So that means we're going to be describing IEP meeting strategies that build trust between families and professionals before the IEP meeting. I'll be describing IEP meeting strategies that maintain trust between families and professionals during the meeting. And then finally, describing IEP meeting strategies that foster trust between families and professionals after the meeting, recognizing that the IEP meeting is more than the day it exists. It is before, during, and after. It is a process. And so throughout today's session, I'd like you to think about how all of the stages of the IEP meeting can be addressed to provide opportunities for meaningful family participation. So before we get started, there's two really important considerations as you hear the remainder from me. The first is that I always like to emphasize the student should always be considered the first and most important member of the IEP team. So although I will be talking about strategies that mention mostly families and professionals working together, that is the focus of this presentation. But we should never forget that the student should always be involved. And there's a lot of great resources out there on student involvement in the IEP meeting process, something I love to see and do. And then finally, as I go through this, I will be using the terms families and parents and teacher, educator, and professional interchangeably so that I am speaking to the wide variety of audiences that we have here. And I'd like to acknowledge that families are different in all their unique characteristics and that every family is different. And so as we go through these meeting strategies, think about all the diversity that does exist in families and the different ways that we may have our families coming to our IEP meeting or participating in our IEP meeting. So let's first look at what the definition of trusting family professional partnerships is and why this is the key, why we're even talking about trusting family professional partnerships. First and foremost, trusting family professional partnerships are characterized by an alliance in which families and professionals confidently build in each other's word, judgment, and wise actions to, emphasis here at the end, increase educational benefits for students and themselves. So why are we here learning about meeting strategies between families and professionals? Because we know that the IEP, Individualized Education Program, is the child's individualized program. And what that means is that document, that set of guidelines, strategies, interventions, supports, et cetera, goals, those are all created with this multi-interdisciplinary team, families and educators together with the intent to increase those educational outcomes for students academically, emotionally, behaviorally, and socially. We know that years of research shows that when families and educators work together, that outcomes for students are good. And that includes improved school participation, improved grades, improved many studies. There are over 40 years of studies that show good things happen when families and educators work together. So keep that in mind as we move forward with the IEP meeting strategies today. The reason why these strategies are being presented is because we want to promote that trusting family professional partnership throughout the IEP meeting process so that we can achieve those benefits that we have so well documented in our research for our students with disabilities. So I'd like to first acknowledge that the Individualized Education Program process has two mandatory components. Those are the IEP team process, and that includes the development and the review. And that is what we will be discussing today. And then of course, there's the IEP document, and that's the student's program. And that is an entire session altogether about the document. Today, we're focusing on the process of developing that document, reviewing that document, and maintaining that trusting partnership between families and professionals throughout that student's individualized education program implementation. I'd like to also emphasize the main reason why this session is existing is because we know that conflict between families and professionals is most likely to occur at IEP meetings during the process. So although we certainly want to encourage and develop and foster those partnerships, this is also a prevention standpoint of saying that if we know conflict is likely to develop in IEP meetings, and we know that often when conflict develops between families and professionals, the student is often lost in that conflict. We don't want that. We want the student's needs addressed and met most appropriately. So to do that, we like to prevent conflict and make sure we have a really good, solid process. So why do we have conflict that develops at IEP meetings? There are specific barriers to developing and nurturing trust and equity that take place during the IEP meeting. The first is an inequity, and that is in many different areas. That could be in power. For example, the district has been noted as having all of the school records and all of the information and all of the expertise that is needed to address the student's needs. There's a process that is in itself inequitable for many families that can be challenging with how they participate. And then expectations with family participation or membership during the IEP meeting might be inequitable and a lot of times unrealistic when it comes to working with diverse families or any families altogether. We need to understand the uniqueness of each family. And that comes with understanding that there may be language, communication, or cultural issues that get in the way with those barriers. There might be a mistrust based on past experience. Unfortunately, we have a lot of families who've shared stories in research studies and in our own experiences with them of maybe sometimes having a previous teacher who may have said something that was really hurtful or harmful or done something hurtful or harmful to the family. And there might be a hard time trusting educational professionals after that. There might even be some family members who might have had a bad experience as a student themselves in schools, and therefore they naturally have a mistrust from their own background or experiences. There's sometimes a difference in values, attitudes, and beliefs that creates barriers to those partnerships. There may be incompatible goals or expectations about the students. The school might be promoting one type of intervention or approach for a student, and the family might disagree or not be supportive of that and have a different type of goal or expectation that is different. And there's, of course, systemic and procedural obstacles that are well documented throughout the research about the IEP meeting barriers, including excessive paperwork, a lot of components that are required that are overwhelming to families, a lot of signatures, a lot of aspects of the document that might be that might be difficult to understand or interpret. And then finally, there's environmental barriers that exist a lot at IEP meetings. Those could be something as simple as, and it's not really simple, but it could be chairs that a family member might be sitting in at an IEP meeting, where family members have talked about being asked to sit in kindergarten-sized chairs when they're not comfortable for them, or having a meeting take place at an area that's uncomfortable for them. Or there might be a room where all of the educators are sitting on one side and the family members on another. These types of things have been documented and shared throughout many parent stories in research and practice as barriers to developing and nurturing trust and equity in that partnership. What we know, bottom line, about families in the IEP meeting process is that families report feeling excluded, powerless, confused, overwhelmed by paperwork, and oftentimes outnumbered. So what can we do about that? Let's look at some key practices that lead to parent satisfaction with the IEP meeting process. I was fortunate to conduct a focus group study with families across the state of Colorado about what it was that they liked at IEP meetings. I specifically asked them, what did you find to be positive aspects of the IEP meeting? What did educators do that you found to be helpful? And these are the major areas that families identified. They said that when educators conveyed a strengths-based perspective about the student, they were more satisfied with the IEP meeting. When meeting strategies were utilized, and I will be going over several of those strategies next. When the team worked together as a team. When families were able to bring outside support to the meeting so that they had someone who was available to be present to support them. When families were able to learn about the IEP process ahead of time, they found more satisfaction with the IEP meeting process. And finally, when families were able to have a supportive educator who was available to advocate for the student. And some of these families said sometimes that meant the teacher speaking out against something that maybe an educator or even an administrator had shared at the IEP meeting, that was the type of advocacy that they appreciated seeing educators exhibit. I should note that in this focus group study, there were families of all children with representing all of the different disabilities across the 13 categories of IDEA, as well as a Spanish-speaking only focus group. So when we look at IEP meeting strategies, when we look at how we can support families, one of the things that I always like to share with individuals is the Sunshine Model of Trusting Family Professional Partnerships that's promoted in the Turnbull and Colleagues 8th edition of the Families and Professional Collaboration textbook that is available in the resources section. This is a very important model because first and foremost, I'd like to emphasize that trust is at the core center of the SUN. And within trust, within that trusting area, there are 5 specific professional behaviors that have been identified in the research as meaningful ways to build trust with families. And that is an educator who's able to demonstrate respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. And during this Sunshine Model, we know that there are several opportunities for those educators and families to develop those trusting partnerships that demonstrate respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. And those activities include academic learning, social emotional learning, behavior, student assessment, special meetings, which in this case is the Individualized Education Program meeting that we're presenting today, as well as student transitions of all ages and stages, and school capacity enhancement. We will be using the Sunshine Model, and throughout the before, during, and after meeting strategies, you will notice that all of the strategies that are promoted and encouraged here are founded within the principles of respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. So when we apply those strategies, we apply them before, during, and after the meeting. And the first thing we always want to be mindful of is that in order to be a trusting IEP team member, we need to be someone who is, and I introduced myself as a behavior analyst, I like observable and measurable behaviors for educators to know and understand. So those observable and measurable trusting behaviors are someone who is benevolent, reliable, competent, honest, and open. So now, as an IEP team member who is trusting, let's talk about some procedural steps that you can conduct before the meeting that demonstrate respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. First and foremost, schedule an agreeable time for the meeting that fits with the family and the student. This comes up more often than it should in the research. If we want family members to be actively engaged and meaningfully participate in the way that we know the research shows works for student outcomes, then we want to make sure our families can come to those meetings and be present in those meetings. So it's important that we schedule that agreeable time. It's also important that we confirm the date, time, frame, and location of the event prior to the meeting, days before the meeting, weeks before the meeting. It's important that we remind families and all of the other IEP team members so that they're able to confirm and come and be present during the entire meeting. It's important to, of course, send the procedural safeguards in advance and ask if there are any questions related. And if there are any available parent-friendly procedural safeguards that your district or region or community or organization has created, I encourage you to use those because a lot of research has shown that that helps. We know that procedural safeguards are written in a language that is at a graduate student level. So the more that we can explain these procedural safeguards to families so that they're able to understand them, the greater the outcome for, again, the student. And that's why we're all here. And then share and collect any information needed for discussion ahead of time. I really encourage to have these procedural steps taken so that we can address any issues or concerns prior to being at the meeting. We can start to at least develop or understand what might be taking place so that when we are at the meeting, we can have an active discussion and an actual meeting rather than something where we're just talking at the families. Of course, it's important to arrange for an interpreter if needed. And it's important that prior to that meeting, you communicate with the interpreter. I encourage you to meet with an interpreter about 30 minutes to 20 minutes prior to the meeting or at some point prior to the meeting to go over any key glossaries, terms, acronyms, or items that that interpreter may need to know, and also to talk with that interpreter about how long you should wait between pausing to allow them to convey the oral message, and then also be sure that you allow the interpreter during the meeting to interpret and then allow that family member to process what was interpreted. And then, of course, ask and arrange for any accommodations that family members might need. There might be some physical needs, there might be some visual needs, there might be some all different types of needs. So it's important that we ask and accommodate for those needs ahead of time. So after conducting those procedural steps before the meeting, or simultaneously, I should say, there's some trust building steps that you should do before the IEP meeting as well, that also promote respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. Those are, first and foremost, connect with the family and the student before the meeting. That's where you might have some really important conversations. Talk with the family members and the student and ask them, how did things go this year? What kinds of things have you been working on? What kinds of things would you like to work on next year? This is your opportunity to talk with families and find out how the implementation of the students' goals from the previous year went out in the school and in the home and the community. To ask them what are some of their needs for the home and community moving forward. This information can provide us with the type of background and knowledge that we might need for the development of a really meaningful IEP for that student. This is why we have family members as active participants in the IEP team. And then sharing accurate present levels and baseline information before the meeting can be incredibly helpful. A lot of times families will ask for that information ahead of time, but a lot of families don't know to ask for that information. And the reason why families find it helpful is that it will allow them time to process some of the information that will be shared or discussed during the meeting. When we're at an IEP meeting, remember, this is a process before, during, and after. It's important that we're able to really have a conversation about how to best meet the student's needs. If we have a foundational understanding of what that child's present levels and needs are prior to the meeting, we don't need to spend so much time on discussing those. We can emphasize more on discussing them and what we're going to do to address them, which is the really important component of that IEP meeting. It's important that we also gain input about the student's academic, behavioral, and social growth before drafting those goals. Families see their students differently. Families see their children differently in different contexts, in different environments, in different situations, in all sorts of different components that will show that educators may never see a child. And so it's important that we get to know that component from the family's perspective. And then collaboratively discuss the focus for the meeting. So talk together prior to the IEP meeting about what your expectations are for the meeting. Ask the families what their expectations are for the meeting. Discuss your shared expectations for the meeting. So then when you get to that IEP meeting, you're already coming together with a shared understanding and focus for the duration of that meeting. And then finally, send the draft of the IEP home to the family members only if it's appropriate after gaining family input. Remember, this is draft goals, so they're never permanent, and we would never send them ahead of time if we didn't include the family members in the drafting of them prior. So if we're asking of their input about what goals they have moving forward, what they like to work on, how things have been going, et cetera, then we can feel comfortable if the family wants to receive a copy of those goals ahead of time, that IEP ahead of time, the draft, then we can request that. And then we can use that draft as a starting point, again, so we can have a meaningful conversation. I really want to emphasize that the IEP meeting should be a conversation, a meeting, not educators talking to the families, delivering information, and then everyone signing and leaving. So there's a lot, if you look at that IEP document, expectations, there's a lot of information that is essentially being covered during what's typically scheduled for about an hour or less in some schools. And so what that means is the more pre-work we can do, the greater the outcome for a conversation that's meaningful about addressing that student's needs moving forward. So now let's talk about during the meeting. Some environmental supports are really encouraged to support that meaningful dialogue that we want to have, where we want to have that active family involvement and engagement during the IEP meeting. So some environmental supports that encourage respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment include, first, arranging the tables and chairs so that everyone is comfortable. Let's make sure that we're in an environment that is comfortable for everyone, that the temperature is good. We don't have we have minimal distractions as much as we can, etc. We want to avoid power physical imbalances through seating choices. So it's really important that we maybe all sit together on a circular table. If we have a circular table, that's great. But I really encourage that educators be mindful of how they're sitting and how that physical imbalance might come across to family members. It's important that we address all emails, phone calls earlier, text messages, etc., so that we're not going to be disrupted during that meeting. We establish an agreeable time that's allotted for the meeting. And it's important that we establish that agreeable time at the very beginning of the meeting for all IEP team members present. And that we ask all IEP team members that they should remain for the duration of the meeting. We don't want what we see in some research cited as what we see a revolving door, where family members say that it's very discomforting when they're at an IEP meeting and an educator comes, shares information, and then leaves without providing the family opportunities to discuss or engage with that educator. And oftentimes that educator will leave before the meaningful discussion is taking place with the entire team. That can really challenge what the intent of the IEP meeting is for. So it's really important that we establish that agreeable time and that we make sure that our educators and all members are committed to staying for the duration of the meeting. If they're not able to stay committed for the duration of the meeting, because we recognize that life happens, meetings happen, other situations come up, especially for those middle and high school educators. If that is the case, then establish in the agenda, talk ahead of time about when that educator is going to be coming and presenting, how long, and make sure that prior to their departure, that they're involved in any key discussions they should be, as well as that the family members have an opportunity to have a conversation with them. And finally, when it comes to that agreeable time line for the meeting, I want to also establish that it's important that we begin the meeting at the time we said we would begin it, and we end it at the time we said we would end. Unfortunately, I've heard stories about family members losing their jobs because although they were told the meeting would end at a certain time, and after encouraging the team to end, they were embarrassed to say they had to leave. And family members have lost their jobs because they weren't able to return their job in time. So we really need to be mindful of those time expectations. And it is okay. It's a very important meeting, and it will behoove us time-wise and student support-wise if we're not able to cover everything that we feel that we need to in the time we've allotted. It's okay to schedule another time. I know that more meetings are sometimes challenging for educators and family members, but at the same time, we're going to be spending more time potentially addressing challenges or fires, so to speak, with the child if we're not being proactive with planning that IEP meeting ahead of time. So in other words, if we're not talking about all the ways to meet that student's unique needs and having a really well-developed IEP program, individualized education program for that student, we might end up spending endless time with emergency phone calls, challenges, discussions, et cetera, that might be related to not being able to meet the student's needs. So more time is is upfront sometimes a better thing. And then finally, be prepared for distractions. If you know there's going to be distractions during the meeting, let the family members know. If you're having a meeting at a school and you know that there's going to be announcements, et cetera, let them know. If it's on Zoom, et cetera, also let them know if you're doing an online meeting. More meeting strategies during the meeting. Some specific things that you can do to demonstrate respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment involve, first, using an agenda. Having an agenda provides the participants with an understanding of what is going to be covered and taking place. And that can be very helpful for time management, so that if a family member wants to talk about something that's behavioral and they see that it's on the agenda, they will hold off on maybe bringing that up until the behavior time. So that keeps people on topic, on focus. And I've seen agendas where they will allot time and it will be variable, but they will try to provide that so that everyone is able to see what's going to be addressed and in the time that it will be addressed. Second, establish meeting norms. These are brief expectations. So things that we expect in the meeting, they don't need to be long or contentious in any way. Sometimes people think that by saying meeting norms, we're essentially saying that we're expecting a conflict. That's not necessarily true at all. Meeting norms essentially just establishes a general expectation of the behavior of all of the members of the IEP during that meeting. So for example, it might be something as simple as, please wait to speak when it's your turn, or always package a criticism with a solution so that we're being proactive. It could be things like honor time management and time commitments. Please silence our phones. These are meeting norms that should be established as a group. And some schools or teachers might have their own preset meeting norms. I have some available ones in this series for you, but you may also want to adapt and create your own as a group. And that's perfectly fine as well. And then using a parking lot, which is a meeting strategy that comes from the business world, actually, for off-topic issues or concerns that need to be addressed further. So it's not an actual parking lot, obviously, but we identify, we call it a parking lot, or you might just call it an area where you would design and maybe on a flip chart, you would write the word parking lot and you would say, we're identifying, or you might just write areas to address later. And so whenever a topic comes up during the meeting that might be off topic, might not be on the agenda, it's important that we still acknowledge it for the educator or the family member or the student that brought it up, but we don't want to go off of our agenda. We need to stay focused. So for the parking lot, we might acknowledge, say, well, I appreciate you sharing that. That's important information to hear. We're going to, because we're talking about academic goals and not behavior right now, we're going to write this in the parking lot. So when we do get to behavior, we will make sure we address that. What that does is it keeps the focus on the meeting. It acknowledges anyone who may have said something off topic without derailing them and making them feel less than a team member. And so that's a really important thing to keep things moving along for building that trust and maintaining it. It's important that during the meeting, we allow time for discussion. So if we're presenting an intervention or a strategy, let's allow time, wait, ask family members, what would that look like in your home? What might that look like in the community? How can I support you with implementing that? And then of course, before you move on to another section of the IEP meeting, make sure you gain agreement from all team members before moving on. So this is a way that we encourage active parent participation. So we don't say things like, does anybody have any questions? Instead, we'd say, say to the parent, Mrs. So-and-so, how do you feel about this goal? Are you comfortable? What questions do you have about this? How can I support you with this before we move on? Or does everybody want to provide me a thumbs up that you understand and you're ready to move on? Some type of way to acknowledge and understand that they're ready to move to the next section. So we are not derailing family participation. Let's talk about some common barriers and solutions to the IEP meeting. So this is important for promoting respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. So during the meeting, some common barriers might be mistaking silence for agreement and understanding. So instead, a solution would be check with all IEP team members for agreement and understanding. Another barrier might be sharing information verbally without visual support of the information shared. That can be pretty challenging. A lot of people like visual support. For example, you're all receiving visual support right now. So I would just encourage you to always provide visual support. A barrier to might be responding to families without taking the time to process what was shared. So a solution would be, after a person is shared, allow a few moments to take time to process what was shared. Actually mentally repeat in your brain back what they just shared, or a summary of what they shared, and then you can respond to that. One barrier that's really noted is talking directly to the mothers only if both mother and father are present, if it's a family that has a mother and a father roles. So if that, talk to the IEP, all IEP team members who are present. Make sure we're talking to all family members that are present. If the student is present, make sure we're talking to the student. I see a lot of mistakes made where we talk to the family members instead of the student when the student is present. So remember, let's acknowledge the uniqueness of each IEP team member's roles so that we can provide that meaningful opportunity for them. Another barrier is failure to provide opportunities for team discussion. Solution: allow time during the meeting to discuss as a team, including asking team members to share input before moving on to other sections. And then again, as I said earlier, reschedule to another time if more time is needed. More common barriers and solutions. This is the final set. One noted barrier is speaking in jargon or using acronyms. These barriers, by the way, are all noted in research, and so are these solutions. A solution would be to eliminate any and all jargon or acronyms. Provide a definition of what you are discussing, and provide families with special education terminology or acronym dictionary for the future. I've seen a lot of, you can Google that. There's a lot of really information, nice summative information, because although you will do your best to eliminate and not use that jargon, they will hear it at some point. And so it's best to provide them with that information, as well as try to avoid and or provide definitions while you're discussing it. Another barrier is a failure to walk into a meeting with the parents. This comes up a lot with family members. They will say that it's really daunting to walk into a meeting when a group of teachers are all sitting together laughing or talking about something, and then everybody gets quiet when they walk into the room. That can feel a little bit like middle school or high school all over again. So we don't want to do that to family members. We want to create a welcoming message. So instead, create a welcoming message when all IEP team members enter the room and begin the meeting together. A barrier is using deficit-based or age norming language. That comes up a lot in research about conflict with families, that when we use deficit-based language, family members, obviously that's really challenging to hear. And it's something we don't want to do. It's not a very kind thing to do. And it's really not very meaningful for family members and ultimately the student. It doesn't really do anything to support the student to use deficit-based language. Instead, describe the student needs and skills that are needed to meet that need. Barrier is turning the IEP meeting into an adult read aloud. This is what I was trying to say we want to avoid. We don't want to just talk to the families. We want to talk with the families. So instead, pre-meet with them, or provide families with their own copies of all documentation shared, and summarize the information that's needed to be shared in a meaningful and understandable way. Finally, a huge barrier is forgetting the I in individualized. Remember, the student is always at the center of the discussion. All discussion and identified areas should be individualized for the student according to their individualized and identified needs. Now, during the meeting, what can we do if there are difficult conversations or difficult moments that come up? There are some conflict resolution skills that you can use. And these demonstrate respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. Those include things like checking the perception of the person who shared something, reflect on what was shared, asking open-ended questions, paraphrasing, observing body language, and practicing active listening. And finally, after the meeting, at the very end of the meeting, this is the part that many people often forget. I see a lot of pre-meeting and during meeting, but not a lot of after the meeting. This probably is one of the most important parts, because what we see in the research about conflict between families and educators around the IEP meeting, it's that the actual implementation of the IEP meeting is not taking place, or something that was discussed at the IEP meeting is not being implemented. And or they might walk away from an IEP meeting where family members and educators have different expectations or outcomes than what was discussed. So instead, group, add time at the end of your IEP meeting to identify ongoing communication plans. How are you going to continue to communicate with the family? What is the best and most meaningful way for the family and the educator and the student if they're involved in that as well? Schedule any follow-up IEP meetings that may be needed. For example, if you are trying a new intervention, it would be helpful to maybe say that in 6 weeks, the team will reconvene briefly to talk about how things are going and check in. Share upcoming expectation. This is really big. This is when we want to know, educators and family members, we want to know what each member of that group is walking away from understanding, and the student, if the student is present, and I hope they are at that IEP meeting. So what is the student expecting as a result of the IEP meeting? What is the family member expecting? What is the educator expecting? And then as a group, review the action planning. That's all of the things that are going to be done to support that student academically, behaviorally, socially, and emotionally, or according to whatever identified needs they have. And then finally, always plan for the future and work towards student-run IEP meetings if you're not already doing that. So talk about how the student can be involved in the IEP meeting in whatever way that may look like. And there's a lot of research on student-led and student-involved IEP meetings as well that you can look into for more about this. And as we come to a close for this series, I'd like to just share this quote by Henry Ford, and that coming together is a beginning, keeping together is a progress, but working together is success. And so while we may come together at the beginning of the IEP meeting, we may stay together in progress, but we need to work together to promote successful outcomes for students. And that's why we're all here. And so I hope that you found these meeting strategies to be helpful in your own work as an educator and as a family member. This is the end of our module.